the Bible written entirely about one runaway criminal, a man who stole from his master and fled for his life. And yet, this letter is one of the most powerful pictures of grace in all of Scripture. His name barely gets mentioned anywhere else in the Bible, but this one chapter changes how we should see every person we've written off. This is the story of Onesimus. Who was Onesimus? To understand this story, you need to know two names, Onesimus and Philemon. Philemon was a wealthy believer living in the city of Colossae, a leader in the early church, someone Paul knew personally and respected. Onesimus was his slave. In the Roman world, slavery wasn't a side issue. It was baked into the entire economy. Slaves were property, full stop. And at some point, Onesimus did something that could have gotten him killed. He ran away from Philemon's household. Some scholars believe he may have stolen money or goods from Philemon on his way out. Paul actually hints at this later in the letter. A runaway slave in the Roman Empire had almost nowhere safe to go. If caught, the punishment could be brutal: beating, branding, even execution, depending on the master. So Onesimus does what a lot of desperate people did in that era. He disappears into a big city where no one would recognize him. And of all the cities in the empire, he ends up in Rome. Here's where the story gets almost impossible to believe if you don't know how small the early Christian world actually was. In Rome, sitting in prison for preaching the gospel, was the Apostle Paul. And somehow, we don't know exactly how, Onesimus crosses paths with him. Maybe he sought Paul out because he'd heard Paul's name from Philemon's household. Maybe it was a random encounter in a massive city. Either way, this runaway slave ends up face to face with a man in chains for his faith. And something happens that changes the entire direction of his life. Onesimus becomes a believer in Jesus Christ. Paul describes it later using some of the tenderest language in his entire ministry. In Philemon verse 10, writing from prison, he says, "I appeal to you for my son Onesimus, whom I have begotten while in my chains." Paul calls him my son, not the runaway, not the criminal, his son, the man society labeled a piece of property and a fugitive. Paul now calls family. The hardest letter Paul ever wrote. Here's the impossible situation Paul finds himself in. Under Roman law, Paul is legally obligated to return an escaped slave to his master. Under the culture of the day, Philemon would have every right to punish Onesimus severely, maybe even execute him, and no one would have batted an eye. So Paul does something remarkable. He writes a personal letter to Philemon and sends Onesimus back to him, carrying the letter himself. Imagine the courage that took. Onesimus is walking back toward the very household he fled, carrying a letter that is his only hope of mercy. And in that letter, Paul doesn't just ask for leniency. Watch what he actually says in verses 15 through 17. "For perhaps he departed for a while for this purpose, that you might receive him forever, no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother. If then you count me as a partner, receive him as you would receive me." Philemon 1:15-17, NKJ5. Paul is asking Philemon to receive his former slave not just back, but as a brother, as family, as an equal in Christ. In a culture built entirely on the master-slave hierarchy, Paul is asking a slave owner to look at his former property and see a sibling instead. And then Paul goes even further. Verse 18, "But if he has wronged you or owes anything, put that on my account." Philemon 1:18, NKJ5. Whatever Onesimus stole, whatever debt he owed, Paul says, "Charge it to me. I'll pay it myself. Why this matters more than it seems. If that last line sounded familiar to you, it should. Charge it to my account is exactly the picture of what Jesus did for every one of us. We ran. We stole what wasn't ours. We owed a debt we could never repay. And Jesus stepped in and said, "Put that on my account." Paul, in this one small personal letter, only 25 verses long, barely one page in most Bibles, becomes a living illustration of the gospel itself. He's not just writing a nice letter asking for a favor. He's showing Philemon and showing us what grace actually looks like when it's put into practice with a real person, a real debt, and a real relationship on the line. What happened to Onesimus? Scripture doesn't tell us exactly how Philemon responded, but the fact that this letter survived and made it into the New Testament strongly suggests Philemon did receive Onesimus back in grace, just as Paul asked. And there's something else worth knowing. In Colossians chapter 4, verse 9, written around the same time, Paul mentions a faithful and beloved brother being sent along with Tychicus back to Colossae, and names him Onesimus. Some early church historians even believe this same Onesimus went on to become a bishop in the early church decades later. A man who once ran from slavery and shame possibly ends up leading and shepherding the very kind of community that once could have condemned him. The lesson. Here's what this story leaves us with. No one is too far gone, too guilty, or too far outside the family of God to be called son or brother. Onesimus was a runaway, possibly a thief. Every legal and cultural system of his day said he deserved punishment, not welcome. But grace doesn't ask what you deserve. Grace asks what price has already been paid on your behalf. Paul told Philemon, "Put it on my account." Jesus tells every one of us the exact same thing. Whatever debt you're carrying, whatever mistake you think disqualifies you, it's already been charged somewhere else. That's the story of Onesimus, a man history almost forgot, but grace refused to let go of. If this one meant something to you, go ahead and subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear that their past doesn't get the final word. See you in the next one.